I invite you to turn to our text this morning. I would like to read just a couple of additional verses that are not included in the text that were given to us in our outline this morning. I'm just going to be reading this from the NIV, and then I want to read a couple of verses from 1 John as well, as we think about pastoral transparency. For you were once darkness. This is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8. For you were once darkness, but now are you light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. And then verse 13, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. Now 1 John chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. If we say we have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. The well-known theologian / baseball player Yogi Berra once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And as I thought about that, I thought that's really what I was feeling when I was asked to share on vulnerability and transparency. And I shared with James this morning, it was a bit of a challenge for me to know how to transition from vulnerability to transparency, and how that those two are the same and how they are separate. And so as we start out here this morning, I will start this session by building on some of the things from yesterday's session on vulnerability, with a focus on transparency as it relates to the character and the integrity and the internal condition of the pastor and the pastor's heart, and then transition a bit more to focus on transparency as we pastor our congregations. So as you think of transparency, I'm not sure what comes to your mind, what it is, but transparency really is asking the question, who are we? Who are you? Who am I? And can we really know? And by the way, my concern as we address this subject is that we address it from a perspective of assuming that there must be something wrong with somebody, or there must be something bad, and that transparency is in place so that because there's probably something wrong. And I want to say here in the onset that I'm approaching the subject with a firmly held belief that I am speaking to men, to women of integrity, people that have a heart for God and humanity to the best of our abilities. And I would hope that addressing this subject does not leave us looking at each other with suspicion and distrust. However, I do think that it is important, given the climate that we find ourselves in today, some of the recent happenings in churchianity, in the Christian realm. As I was sharing with James this morning, there has been things that have taken place that have given the enemies of God reason to blaspheme. And I think we need to be humble about that, and we need to be open about it, and we need to talk about some of those things. And so we'll be addressing some of that in the onset here this morning, and then, like I said, moving on. Several years ago, a friend of mine, I'll call him Barry, he lived alone in a rough section of Cleveland, and he passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. Another friend of Barry's had called the police because he wasn't able to get a hold of him, and the police went over to check on him. The house was locked up, so the police had to crawl up through an upstairs bedroom and go in, and they found my friend, found his lifeless body there. A day or so later, Barry's brother called me and said he just couldn't get himself to go into his deceased brother's house, and he wondered if I, as his pastor, could go with him and go and see if he could locate a will or any other document that would give us direction on how to proceed with the funeral arrangements and so forth. And so I met him there, and as I crawled through that same upstairs window, I could see exactly where my friend had died and where the police had found him. And it was a very weird feeling, to say the least. And it felt like I was invading my friend's space, even though he'd gone to be with the Lord. And his brother and I spent the next several hours combing through my friend's files, his books and drawers and belongings, looking for anything that would help us know how to best move forward. Needless to say, it gave me a transparent perspective of a friend that I had known for nearly 30 years, been a part of our church. I had traveled a lot with, eaten a lot of Sunday dinners together with him. I had a perspective of him that I'd never had before, and it was an interesting experience for me. So today, as pastors, I think it would be fair if we would ask ourselves at this moment who we really are, and if that could become evident somehow, maybe on the screen here, it would become evident to all of us in this room. Would that be the good news, or would that be the bad news? And I really appreciated what Brother Paul had to share about lifting holy hands. I just wholeheartedly agree with that. I was thinking about that some time ago, and I realized that when we're in a setting like this, we can lift our hands as a show. We can do that. But I would like to challenge you to try to do that in your own personal prayer closet sometime. If your hands are not clean, try to pray with lifted hands. I believe you'll find it to be nearly impossible. There's something about lifting hands when it is true. There's something that happens. I don't know what it is, but I found it to be almost impossible to do it. If there's something going on inside of me, I can't do it when it's just me and God. I can do it in your presence, but I can't do it when I'm alone. So there's something to it. So thank you for sharing that, brother, this morning. Now maybe it's just me, but sometimes when I see a photo of myself, it doesn't really look like me. I don't know if you've ever experienced that or not. We send family pictures out every year, and this guy standing with, my family doesn't quite look like the one I see in the mirror. And sometimes when I hear a recording of myself speaking, it doesn't really sound like the voice I hear in my head. And so I don't know if you've experienced that, but that's kind of what I experience sometimes. Norman Rockwell, as you know by now, is a favorite author or a favorite artist of mine, and he did a painting one time called a triple self-portrait. I have that with me today. It's a little smaller than the one I had yesterday, so I'm not going to post it here. But this is called a triple self-portrait. Most of you have probably seen this portrait. But as I thought about transparency, my mind went to this picture, and I studied it. I found that there's so much in this painting here. And so a self-portrait, it's an opportunity for the artist to reveal something about himself. And so Rockwell shows himself here in the mirror through the distorting lenses of his own perspective. And you can see that. There's several different shots or views of the same person here. Also, you see here that he's placed himself in the illustrious company of several pretty famous people over here. And so it's Durer, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Picasso. They're all pinned right here, okay? So he's right next to them. Now, you also see a helmet here, and this is kind of his saving grace. The helmet that he put on top of the painting there, he picked up in Paris one time when he was there, because he thought it was probably something that some Greek or Roman soldier had probably worn, only to find out after he had it for a while it was something that all of the French firemen wore. And so there you have it. Now, the three perspectives are very evident here. We have what he really looks like in the mirror. I mean, this is what he looks like. Mirrors don't typically lie. And this one here is what he'd like to think he looks like. And then, of course, you have the backside of him, a perspective that everyone else has that we can't have of ourselves. We can't see our backsides. So I found that to be fascinating as I looked at that portrait, and found it to be so fitting with how we evaluate ourselves sometimes. And so today I would like to suggest that pastoral transparency does not begin with me living honestly towards you, but it begins with me living honestly towards me. And that can be a real challenge. Shakespeare has famously said, "This above all, to thine own self be true." Now, that's a quote that's been interpreted in a lot of different ways, but I think it could apply to our subject today. God, in his infinite wisdom, has created human beings uniquely different to the rest of his created beings in the world that we live in. But just like in so many other ways, a unique and superior quality can also create unique and superior challenges for us. And as most of you know, our strengths, our greatest strengths can also become our greatest weaknesses. Or someone has said that our blessings can become our curses. And I think that can apply to us as pastors, as human beings. And the fact that we've been given the amazing capacity by our Creator to choose between good and evil also means that we have the capacity to deceive even ourselves. In his book, I Told Me So, Greg Elshoff identifies several methods we use to deceive ourselves. He gives 5. I suppose there are others. But he says we manage our attention, we rationalize, we switch perspectives, we adjust our sentiments, and we procrastinate. I'll just give those again. We manage our attention, we rationalize, we switch perspectives, we adjust our sentiments, and we procrastinate. And sometimes I think we might do these and we hardly even know that we're doing it. And I think it's important for us to understand that in and of itself, these things are not wrong. In fact, they can be very, very good. It's just like a $10 bill. You can use that to buy a nutritious meal, or you could spend it on tobacco and Mountain Dew or whatever. So it's potential that we have that God has intended us to use for good. And so I think we are rightly stunned when we hear that arguably the most prominent and capable Christian apologist of our day, a man who profoundly impacted millions of people, including myself, for the good and for the kingdom of God, was actually living a double life. I, for one, did not want to believe it. In fact, I didn't for some time. He had a tremendous impact on my early ministry. He helped me understand he helped me understand God in a very real way, and I treasure those truths that I received. But he was also a person of extraordinary brilliance and spiritual understanding. And yet, it is true that he was asking for sexual favors from women, telling them it was a way for them to contribute to the work of the kingdom of God. And we wonder, how can someone of such exceptional brilliance come to that place? Did he actually believe it? I think it's possible. I think it's possible that he actually did. We hear of a sought-after Christian speaker who kissed dating goodbye and wrote about a superior way to pursue marriage in a way that almost guaranteed success in your marriage. And yet today we hear of the fact that he kissed his marriage goodbye. In fact, he's kissed Christianity goodbye, is what they tell me. And then we have our stories that are closer to home. We hear of abuse cases. We hear of people in ministry questioning even their belief in God. And we wonder, where did this come from? How is this even possible? And I think these things surprise us and catch us off guard. That is, until we honestly understand the capacity of our own heart to rationalize, to switch perspectives, to manage our attention spans, or whatever other technique we choose to apply to our own set of circumstances. So I think that one of the first steps towards living transparently as pastors is truly accepting the fact that my present and current existence may involve areas of personal blindness and self-deception. Can we acknowledge that from at a heart level, that right now there may be some things within me that I am blind to? I think that simply acknowledging that and actually believing it is a first step towards living transparent. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke with a seasoned older brother, a pastor, counselor, and I asked him about his insights. I told him I had this session coming up and wondered if he had anything to contribute. And his comment was something along this line. He's currently working with a church that had been through a lot of issues and had a division, and he's been put in place of leadership there to try to work their way through and find a way forward for them. And he said something like this. He said, I think that sometimes pastors can be fairly unaware of how their own influence has affected the current state of affairs. Therefore, it's difficult for them to take ownership of it or to take the corrective measures that need to be taken when something is broken. Just simply not aware of how I have contributed to the problem. It's easy to see how there were other ingredients and other things that contributed, but often it's hard to see how I've contributed. Also, I need to know again, what is the ending time here? Does someone have that? 10:15. Okay. All right, thank you. Sometimes these pastors, these persons are very gifted people, and well-liked men, which I think makes the need for transparency even greater, but probably less likely. A pastor's giftings or pastor's talents can provide a lot of camouflage for his faults. And it can be very difficult to convey what is actually true about certain pastors or leaders to those who admire his giftings, to those who admire and like his personality. Today, liking someone is really important. And to those who agree with certain positions or ideologies on specific issues. And so if you agree with what he has to say, it's easy to sort of blind yourself to what the truth really is. I think in the world of politics, and I don't talk politics over the pulpit, but I think it was fairly difficult for conservatives to to acknowledge that at least in some ways, our previous president may have been his own worst enemy. It's kind of hard to admit that because, we kind of liked what some of his policies. Some time ago, I was having a conversation with one of my adult children about a really tough situation we were dealing with involving someone else. And at some point, she says something like, "Dad, I don't think you're at a very good place in regards to this situation, or I don't think you're dealing with it correctly." And so I went on to explain to her what I had done correctly, of course, and what I had not done incorrectly, which to me seemed like should be plenty of evidence to her to know that her perspective was misguided. And at some point she said something that I don't think I'll ever forget. She said, "Dad, it's not what you're doing and it's not what you're not doing." She said, "It's what I feel. It's what I feel." And so I just had to finally say, "Okay, you're going to have to show me something that I can't see." And from that day forward, there was an illumination that started happening inside of me. And today, I believe she was actually correct. I was blind to something I couldn't see. And it wasn't particularly comforting when my wife reminded me that she'd been trying to tell me this for a long time. And so they were right. And today, the situation that we were discussing is a much healthier place because I was able to see something that was hidden from me right there in plain sight. Jesus in Mark 7 quoted from Isaiah when he said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And we can clearly see that that was true with the Pharisees, but it's much harder to see it when it's actually going on in our own hearts. Apostle Paul in Romans 7 said, "I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do." And Paul was being honest about this whole struggle to actually know himself, what's true within himself. Jeremiah, without sugarcoating, simply says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" But the good news is, verse 10, it says, "I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings." And that really, really is the good news, because I believe we can know what the truth is about our hearts, but usually we cannot know that by ourselves. Usually we're going to need help to really know that. So what is transparent, pastoral transparency supposed to look like? Jesus was the chief shepherd and the bishop of the church, and he came into this world and introduced a way of pastoring that was so unlike and so profoundly different from the religious leaders of the day that they simply rejected him. But to those who chose to follow him, it was a way that brought life, it brought light, it brought love, it brought power into their otherwise and sometimes dysfunctional and hopeless circumstances. In Matthew 22:16, I was fascinated when I came across this passage. It describes who Jesus was this way. And I want to note who said this, but it says, "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity, that you teach the way of God in accordance with truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are." Now, the ones who said this were not his disciples. In fact, they said it with malicious intent, and they said it as a way to trap him. And yet, I think the way that they characterized Jesus, at least I believe, was based on the reputation that he had gained by both his disciples and his detractors. Listen to what they said again. "A man of integrity, you teach the way of God in accordance with truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are." Imagine if that could be said of us as pastors, even by our enemies. I believe that would be so good. To his disciples, Jesus simply said, "Follow me." So in contemporary terms, I believe Jesus basically said, come hang out with me, watch me, listen to me, spend time with me. That's how Jesus led. And so in short, they came to know Jesus beyond the scope of rabbi, teacher, and preacher, or even elevated leader. He was their pastor and he became their friend. That's who Jesus was. In John 15 it says, I no longer call you servants because a master doesn't confide in his servants. Now you are my friends since I told you everything the Father told me. The perfect model of pastoral transparency. There you have it in Jesus Christ. A number of years ago, early in my ministry, there was a man who modeled this concept to me. I had been asked to speak at some kind of a conference along with a couple of other men, and one of them was Brother Paul L. Miller. Many of you know Brother Paul L. from Kansas. And Paul, in my mind, was one of the wisest, most godly, seasoned men that I knew. Much older than I am, been around for a long time. And at this conference, he came to me, and he wondered if I could meet with him for a few minutes in his dorm. And there was a few things he said he wanted to run past me. And as I sat there across from him in his room, he gets out the notes for his session the next day. And he said, Laban, I just want to run some things past you. He said, this is what I plan to say. And this is what I was thinking would be the right thing to do and to say and all of that. And my mind just started to space out. And I was thinking, there's something so wrong about this scene. I'm this young whippersnapper, wet behind the ears, new minister. And here is this man of God. He'd probably forgotten more than I knew that day. And yet there he sat, bouncing his notes off of me, this young, inexperienced person. And I have no idea what the questions were, what the subject content was. To this day, I don't know. But the gift Brother Paul gave me that day, I will never forget. Brother Paul was not trying to be transparent. It was just who he was. I don't think he realizes the gift he gave me, because he wasn't trying to give me a gift. He was simply being who he was, modeling, I believe, the character of Christ. Today, as you already know, pastors, simply because of the nature of our calling and job description, live in a potential volatile environment. Let me quickly remind you of what our job description looks like. 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. He must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert. He may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. Now, with these lists of requirements in your mind, how many of you, like Christ, are willing to tell your church, come hang out with me, come follow me, just spend time, watch me? How many of us are willing to do that? I think that without saying, we wonder in our humanity, is this even possible? And it can feel overwhelming, it can feel intimidating when we realize really what our calling entails. It can seem like we become this perpetual target for either praise or criticism. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. And with the potentially volatile reacting emotions of either pride or shame. That's the life of a pastor. I think pastors get way too much praise or way too much criticism, and they take it way too personal. And so what can we do? Well, I think we could try several things. We could try to put our best foot forward and strive to get it right and live as if we do. And I think that probably describes in a small way the first number of years of my ministry, I should say of our ministry. when my wife and I were first ordained, we did not like the idea of average. We were not going to be average. Today, we're probably well below average, to tell you the truth. Secondly, we could try to lower the standard and make excuses for our humanity. After all, nobody can live up to all of it all the time anyway. So that's another option we could try. Or we can live transparently, which means we acknowledge that the standard of 1 Timothy never changes. It's a good thing. It's God-given. And then as pastors, we accept the role, knowing full well that we will not live it out without fault and failure. And thirdly, we can choose to live into our job description before a watching congregation with honesty and humility. A few years ago, I was asked to come speak at a church some distance from our community. It had something to do with a year-end thing, relationships, family, maybe marriage. I don't remember exactly what it was about. But I remember traveling to this speaking engagement, and Julie and I were traveling in the car towards our destination, and you would have thought we'd been, holding hands and discussing the beautiful feelings we had for each other as we prepared to share. And I have no idea what the conversation was about. All I know is it wasn't very pretty, and we're on our way to talk about, things. And somehow, an argument with your wife on the way to speaking engagement about relationships doesn't really seem to match the description of 1 Timothy chapter 3. On another occasion, I was heading out of state for a series of meetings again. And shortly before we arrived at our destination, I got pulled over for speeding. And I had to speak on authority Sunday morning. And so I decided I was just going to be honest, and I used it as a sermon illustration, which I think was of the Lord, because at lunchtime they passed the hat and ended up covering the cost of the citation. So I think honest humility about our failures does not compromise the standard of holiness. Instead, I think it can bring hope and courage to both ourselves and those that we lead. The Bible wouldn't have had to tell us about Abraham's dishonesty or David's failures. It wouldn't have had to tell us about the dissension between Paul and Barnabas. But I think that's one of the reasons the Bible is so incredibly effective in our lives today, because we can relate to it. And that's what's good. Carrie Nieuwhof said, "People admire our strengths, but they identify with our weaknesses." I think we need to remember that. Telling honest, self-incriminating stories are only one way for us as pastors to relate authentically and transparently in a way that contributes to an overall honest and accountable environment that is not critical or judgmental. Nothing good can happen in a critical and judgmental environment. You see, my wife and I, despite our failings, still have something of value to give, even at an event that's about relationships. We still have something of value to give if we can do it with honest humility. The truth is that there's probably nothing that has stretched our marriage, and maybe even stressed our marriage more, than things surrounding my call as a pastor. And we're supposed to tell, other couples how to do it right and how to live and all of that. The truth is that the very call that I have, has been a source of a lot of stress. But we have also grown. I believe today we share a love that is much deeper than if we would not have went through some of those hard times. Understanding the spiritual dimension is one of the main reasons that we can live honestly and transparent as pastors. What if in the moment we could understand that the little thing that just came out of the blue between you and your spouse or your son or your daughter just before it's time to preach is really not out of the blue, but instead a very strategic assault from our real enemy, which, by the way, is not your spouse, not your son or daughter. Those things that come up just before you're ready to go preach, it's not out of the blue. And I think understanding that in the moment can be very, 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 very helpful. Several years ago, I'm getting ahead of myself here, just a moment. So the truth, the moment that we as pastors allow praise or criticism to stick to us, the moment that we allow that to happen, and by that I mean attach itself to our persons, we set ourselves up at best, I think, to live on this emotional roller coaster ride, or at worst we set up ourselves for failure. Praise will come, criticism will come, but we have to absorb that in the right way. The truth is that as pastors, we need and we should willingly accept both praise and criticism. But what we do with it personally has so much to do with whether we can live transparently before our watching congregations, what we do with that. And so pastors, I think we need more than fans in our lives. Fans aren't inherently wrong, but fans typically don't really know their celebrities. They don't really know them. Several years ago, as we think about criticism and praise, we were in a meeting, having some kind of a meeting at our church, when a man who lived in our community, who had some family in our congregation, he showed up unexpectedly. He marched up to the front of the church, got behind the podium, and began to berate me as a pastor and accuse me of a number of things, which fortunately, at least that time, weren't true. And there were people crying. Some walked out, and this man's son is pleading with him to stop whatever he's doing. And so what should I as a pastor do in this environment? What am I supposed to do right now? On another occasion, I had just got done preaching a message when a local minister asked if he could get up and say something. And so I stepped to the side of the podium, and he got up and commenced to tell the church that this is the best sermon Laban has ever preached on this subject, and he went on to just heap on the praise in front of everyone else. Now what am I supposed to do? Say amen, brother? You know, two spectrums. That's what our lives consist of. And both of these, I think, are scenarios and opportunities for us to live with honest humility before our church. If we're living transparently, we can accept both praise and criticism because it's really not about us. It's about the call that God has on us. It's about the kingdom of God. By the way, the man that took over the meeting, he came back about 2 years later. This time, you know, he could have went to the front, but he didn't. From the back of the church, he made a very sincere apology to us. Really appreciated that, and I hold no animosity towards him. Another situation we had, it's so important to live transparency, is because probably our congregation knows anyway when we are and when we aren't. We really don't hide a whole lot. I live in a house full of women. I have a wife and 4 daughters, and I found out there's very little hidden in this world, and they see right through stuff. But we had a situation, what I thought would be a volatile situation, a policy decision that we had to make. And it was one of those things that I knew was there. I didn't want to address it. I was hoping that somehow it would just disappear and everything would work out. Well, as you know, those things don't happen. So we needed to address it, and we as a ministry were divided right in half. There was 4 of us on the team at that time, this was years ago. 2 of us were on one side and 2 were on the other, and I knew that those numbers were not going to change. And we're trying to know how to move forward as a church. What do? I'm lead pastor. We could have, tried to fake it till we make it. We could have, I grew up my whole life, there was this preacher's bench that I heard of, that there must be unity on the preacher's bench. And if there wasn't, horrible things were going to happen. And I knew that there wasn't unity on the preacher's bench. Finally, to make a long story short, I went to the church and I said, we as a leadership team are not agreed on this issue, but we are agreed on the fact that we want to relate respectfully towards each other in and relating to this situation. Today we look back on that. Nobody was actually even surprised when I brought that to them, because they could see through it anyway. And we got through that. Today we look back at that circumstance from a very, very positive perspective. There's a number of things that I wanted to say, but I'm going to skip a few things. I just want to say one last thing before I close here. I believe yesterday we talked about the 12-3-1 idea, where we have different ways of relating to different people. The number 3 group that I spent some time on is that group where we can kind of spill our guts and be known specifically. But I have found that there's something that sometimes is needed, especially for lead pastors, but not limited to lead pastors, and that is where you have at least one person that you can go to and you can talk about issues that you can't even talk about with your number 3 group. About 10 or 12 years ago, Kenny introduced me to a man who lived about an hour from us. He was an older, seasoned man. And this man, for the last 10 years, has been a person that we have been able to go to. He's not from our church, but he's very familiar with our type of people in our churches. And he has been our go-to person when we face things in church that we just can't talk about with the church. We can't discuss. When we take our confusions and all of that, he has been this person that has done this for us, has done this for me over the years. And you could call him a coach, you could call him a mentor, a spiritual father. But I believe that one of the biggest missing ingredients with today's pastors in our Anabaptist settings is to have that kind of a person, a minister who ministers to ministers. And it doesn't have to be someone who's ordained, but I personally know seasoned men that have been good men that have been preaching for most of their life, and they've never had such a person. They have carried their loads by themselves. There was nobody they could really share with, nobody to bounce life off of. And there were many mistakes that were made. There were hardships that they endured that, should they have been able to share that with a coach, a mentor, whatever you want to call him, it would have changed the perspective, their perspective in so many ways. This man that I've had for 10 years, I've recently transitioned. He's now about 80 years old, and we needed to make a change. I now have transitioned to scheduled a monthly phone session with a seasoned pastor, counselor from another state. He's a man with a wealth of experience I feel very comfortable dumping on and sharing with. He's also very human and lives in a very real world himself. And I found my conversations with him to be incredibly life-giving, incredibly helpful. Sometimes there's things that you need to talk about that come up between you and your own leadership team. You really need somebody to bounce that off of. And I believe this person can be the person that can coach you into knowing how to live transparently and appropriately before your watching congregation. There's a scripture in Proverbs 27:6. It says, "The wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy." And I think as a pastor, if you do not have such a friend in your world, I highly encourage you to find one. May God bless you as you seek to understand what it means to live as a transparent pastor to your own congregations.